that was really interesting that was throughout your book, and it kind of like, it was like bookends as it was as a theme. And it had to do with your mother and the mantra that she had on her mirror, which was, I forgive myself, I forgive everyone, I am free. Yeah. And I wanted to kind of, I don't, like, you kind of touch on it a few times in your book as to, you know, everything happens for a reason and there are no accidents. And how, like, did you find, like, did you find that was kind of like a motivator for forgiveness, or do you feel like that was something that you kind of you found more that you aligned with as you went on your journey?
That's a pretty good question. I would say that first off, you know, as I mentioned in my book, my mom was a what would be called a life coach nowadays. So all of this personal growth talk was like kitchen table conversations from the time I was 8 or 9 years old. And, you know, inclusive of this concept of everything happens for a reason, or there's no accidents, or we choose our reality, and so I applied a lot of those, aligned with my own sensation of what felt right in relationship to spirit when I was growing up. And I applied a lot of them when I lived in some definitely unsafe environments in my teens at 16, 17, 18. And so I felt like I had mapped out enough life experience, you know, typical teenager, to prove that these things were real, you know, to prove that there was no accidents and that I could create my reality through what I chose to do or chose to direct my focus towards each day. And so then when Mom was murdered, obviously, I got into some arguments with her in my head as I attempted to reconcile these beliefs, right? Like, so initially they weren't framework. Initially, I was like throwing out everything that I had, you know, packed into my noggin over the years as far as ideas or ideals and beliefs, to see what actually stuck. And I would continuously hear her voice in my head saying, Sarah, pay attention. There's no accidents. Everything happens for a reason. And my initial arguing would be like, yeah, Mom, I used to believe you, but then you got murdered. And so I'm kind of having a hard time trusting you at this moment. But she's really pushy in spirit as much as she was in person. And so she'd still be right at it. And eventually, Terry, I felt as I sunk deeper into the what's the word I want to use? The truth of there being an order to things in the universe, the truth of how I experienced life and the sensation in my body that felt like there was purpose and meaning inside of everything, that regrew inside of me in a new way, validating my mom's new age quotes, and her strengthening her voice in my head. And so when it came to forgiveness in those first 10 years, I just filed the concept of forgiveness away somewhere and didn't even think about it. Like it didn't even come into my consciousness that I can recollect at all in those first 10 years. Because in those first 10 years, I was addressing my grief and my anguish and my pain in relation to her loss. And it would have felt like to contemplate forgiveness would be betraying her in some way. I needed to ensure that I had tended to everything that I needed to in relation to her loss. And maybe 10 years is long. I have no idea. I mean, I was 20 when she died. And throughout that time period, you know, when I was 24, I gave birth to twin girls. I gave birth to my son when I was 29. And so a lot of that, I was definitely fully immersed in mothering and in relationship. I've been with my husband, Mark, since the year before Mom died. And, but at that 10-year mark, after I started to recognize I had a relationship with Bright Eyes, and I started that ceremony that I mentioned to you earlier, I began to, forgiveness started to work its way out of the filing cabinet and like to slowly kind of sit on the threshold of my consciousness, just kind of like, hi, I'm over here. And I think I was sitting with that experience I mentioned of compassion, along with my desire for violence, that I would kind of look over, yeah, I don't want to talk to you right now, forgiveness. Mm. However, as these two things started to come into a greater place of harmony with each other, forgiveness would slowly come a little bit closer, and I got curious about it. And I started to question in my own inquiry. And when I'm saying inquiry, I mean in journal writing or in actual, like when I go for walks in the forest, I'm talking out loud to spirit, and I'm like, how does this work? I don't know. Like,
I've got a good visual.
Or I'm singing. Like, I make up songs all the time and sing loudly at the top of my lungs. See, I couldn't live in Toronto, or maybe I could. Maybe I could.
That's why I live like 5 minutes from a huge park.
See, perfect. And so I needed to know that if I forgave him, that I wouldn't be betraying my mom. That was one of the biggest pieces that I had to look at. And I also remember the feeling of, if I forgave him, did that mean that he won? And won what? I don't know, but that's kind of just a piece that came up for me. And so there was a lot of inquiry that I needed to make around forgiveness, that helped me to understand what forgiveness meant to me. And I started to see that forgiveness was letting go of my need to blame him for my experience, letting go of my need to blame him for how I felt about what happened. Now, to let that go, I had to express my sense of victimization. I couldn't just say, oh, it's okay that you killed my mom. I had to actually go through a very visceral experience of screaming and shouting at him in a few of my ceremonies from a victim standpoint, where I was saying, who the fuck do you think you are? Look at what you have done. Look at what devastation you've caused in my life. So it wasn't just a like, oh, I'm going to let that go now. It was, I fully sunk into the embodiment of the sensation of victimization, and then was able to come to a decision of, okay, I can let that go now. I can reclaim my own power around that. And this was not linear in any shape or form. These were ideas that I danced with over the course of a year or so after I finished that ceremony with him. And remember, the ceremony was 9 months long. And so a little over a year after it was done, I was in a shamanic training workshop, actually, that happened to be in the Peace Country of Northern Alberta, which is where my mom was born. And you've been up there yourself, because we've got Salter relatives up there, not far from Grand Prairie. And in this process, we were creating a mandala out of objects in nature that related to our greatest teachers. And, I had gone for a walk, and I always loved doing this kind of stuff because I just would use my intuition, and I would go with what I was attracted to and set the intention beforehand that spirit would just guide me to collect what I needed. And I would identify what it was once I sat down. And so I was doing that, I picked something up, maybe a red clover, and maybe this represented, a teacher that I had in a workshop that was really powerful. So I would blow my connection with that teacher and place it in the mandala, pick up another one, and maybe it was a friend, or maybe it was one of my parents. And until I had all of these teachers and this beautiful mandala that was coming together organically. And then there was one piece left. And when I picked it up, I realized that it represented Peter Bright Eyes. And I realized that I needed to thank him for being a great teacher for me. And in that moment, I saw that I needed to forgive him. And it was like goosebumps went over my whole body. And it was one of those big, moments of awakening, of going, wow, this is true right now. He actually is one of my life's greatest teachers. And what a weird thing, but a true thing. And I needed to acknowledge that. And I was very clear in my own acknowledgement of it, that thanking him for the teachings that had shown up in my life, particularly that of compassion, didn't excuse his actions in harming my mother. Right? And so forgiveness and compassion don't at all erase the need for somebody to be responsible for what they did or what they've done. And so that was very clear in my own self-reckoning process. And that was a really big game changer for me. And so you mentioned initially the quote that I share in my book that was on my mom's bathroom mirror at the time of her death. I forgive myself, I forgive everyone, I am free. And that definitely had been hanging out on the sidelines along with the concept of forgiveness throughout that whole time period. Because, you know, I'd be like, well, come on, how crazy is that? That somebody who was murdered has this prominent quote about forgiveness on their mirror. Obviously, you know, the universe is speaking to me in some form or the other, and, you know, imploring that I consider this idea or concept of forgiveness. And so through that mandala was the first time that I actually said the words out loud, I forgive you. And, you know, and it became a practice throughout the years to come. And that would have been in the fall of 2008, I think, around there, 2007, something like that. And, you know, so as I came up against other obstacles or triggers in the times to come, I would be able to check back in with myself and recognize if there was anything that still needed to be forgiven, you know, or any feelings that needed to be expressed, any anger or upset, which obviously is going to show up. One of the most difficult ones is, you know, part of my journey in understanding him and his family, as you know, is I've gotten to know his sister through the years, and we do talks together on healing trauma or on reconciliation. And she's 13 years younger than him. Marilyn is her name, and she's always endeavored to share whatever, you know, answer any questions that I had, or do her best to help me along my own journey of inquiry. And when I first met her we first spoke on the phone in 2010, but I first met her in 2012. And in that meeting, she invited me over to her place for tea. And one of the things she suggested doing was going through her family photo albums. And when she opened up the photo albums, you know, we're going through it. And then all of a sudden I see Peter in pictures that are different from obviously the one that was shown at the trial, or the one, or not at the one that was shown in the newspaper, or from how I saw him at the trial. And it put me into this like huge fight or flight response. Initially, I was like, holy fuck, I need to get out of here. And I really had to tune into my own higher vision and my own sense of purpose in being there, and take some deep breaths and know that I was there for a reason. And part of my soul's quest was to come into a place of shared humanity and to understand who this man was, and to learn about him through his family. And, you know, so I could breathe through that triggered response and allow my body to metabolize what was arising.
I just think that's so phenomenal, like just like and also just the beautiful relationship that came out of this with Peter's sister. And I think that being able to go into that place and then do it with somebody else, I feel like it wasn't just a healing for you, it was a healing for someone else. And it was probably like that probably bleeds into your own family and Marilyn's family as well, like kind of like closing a chapter. and
even opening one on a deeper level. Like, one of the things in putting this book together, my prayers are for the ancestors, or my connection and my prayers are in relation to the ancestors of my bloodline as much as they are the ancestors of Peter's bloodline. I mean, that part of this experience of shared humanity is learning how to be in right relationship with each other and to heal old wounds. I do believe that my mother's homicide was a result of colonization. It was a result of the practices of decimating a culture over so many years with so much shame, degradation, and genocide, that something's going to blow, right? And likely, Peter had FASD, so fetal alcohol syndrome or effect, which makes it very difficult for a person who is diagnosed with FASD to have an understanding of long-term consequences. So you have somebody who has been in traumatic situations for most of their upbringing, and then they don't have a clear understanding of long-term consequences. It's just, again, more and more breeding ground for more violence, and like hurt kids who become hurt adults who hurt adults. And that's just how it goes. And so that's where I believe that the healing of the colonial wound belongs to all of us. You can't get away from it. So any of the whiteys out there who think that they can just sit back on their white horses and be in that place of this doesn't touch me, it's not true. We're not separate from each other. And so part of my mission, if you will, in sharing my story and putting this book together is I don't want other people to lose their moms in such a devastating way as I lost my mom. And I recognize that it's because of our interconnectedness that we have to figure out another solution to violence other than violence. So how do we come into this right relationship with each other where we can actually see and hear each other? And, Marilyn Bright Eyes, Peter's sister, is one of the most unique characters or humans in my life that I care about very deeply as I've gotten to know her through the years. And every time we do a talk, something big comes up for me, as I'm sure something big comes up for her, right? Typically, I'm sharing my story of mom's death, and she's sharing her stories of overcoming addiction and violence. And so, and then we answer any questions that might come up about reconciliation, or about racial injustice, or about whatever just kind of naturally arises through the conversation or whoever's in the audience. And so it's definitely a relationship that I never would have imagined would have exist in my life. And it's one of the most important ones, because it makes me do some deep soul work each time we're together and ask some big questions and to get real.
I guess because you keep digging deeper, you keep finding more and more and more. And you can share that with others. And
having the conversations that are going to be most powerful and maybe most disturbing for whoever is present, right? Because it's typically people's unwillingness to step outside of themselves and to go, like as humans, we're so quick to otherize. So we're so quick to separate ourselves from whatever we think is painful or traumatic, because it's almost like we don't want the virus of whatever that painful or traumatic thing is to rub off on us, right? And whereas if we're willing to step right into the center of whatever that circle is and recognize our connection to it, then we can be a part of instigating change, however that unfolds.
I think that your book will be a big part in that. I truly do. I truly do. I honestly.
I hope so. Fingers crossed.
I like, even how I was saying, like, it's just like, it just seems like very like universally accessible, and I feel like, it's not just put with like a certain group in mind who the book is for. Like, the book is really for everyone.
And that was my intention too, is that it's to make it universal. Like, I feel like one of my gifts is taking the language of the spiritual, the esoteric, and putting into a practical format. And it doesn't need to be mysterious. Like there's like, not that I want to colonize the mystery. I don't. However, I recognize that sometimes in metaphysical teachings, we get so esoteric that nobody knows what the fuck anybody's talking about. Right?